features some of the most chilling stories in the Bible. Tales about legendary cities destroyed by the hand of God. Sodom and Gomorrah, incinerated in a hail of fire and brimstone. Jericho's walls, tumbling down to the sound of trumpets. But are these stories fact or fiction? Archaeologists are beginning to uncover some answers. Evidence of a catastrophe is everywhere. But does it support the Bible's account or point to something else? It's one of the oldest stories in the world. A tale of two cities whose names are practically synonymous with sin. Sodom and Gomorrah. Over the years, the story of what happened to them has become a titillating parable of sex and pleasure. A moral fable about corruption and sin that comes with a price tag. Which may be why it seems so relevant today. Judging from the evidence, the urge to satisfy the body's various appetites is hardwired into most humans, and some places are known for being party towns, where it's hard to tell the difference between enough fun and too much. "4,000 years or so ago, Sodom and Gomorrah had that kind of reputation. Although the Bible never says exactly what they did to deserve it. Genesis simply says, "Now the men of Sodom were evil and great sinners before the Lord." Later on it mentions abominations, but it doesn't spell out what they were.
We have very little information, actually, about exactly what was going on there. I think that's why Hollywood, among others, is so fascinated by Sodom and Gomorrah. It's open to whatever you want to think. What was going on there? I don't know, but it must have been bad.
But if the Bible is vague about the sins being committed, it's clear about the punishment. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire out of heaven. The Bible goes on to suggest that after Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, they were abandoned. If the biblical story did happen, it probably happened here, in the empty, desolate lands next to a lifeless sea. But even that's not certain.
Like many things in the Hebrew Bible, it's hard to actually pin down a location for places. The Hebrew Bible talks about the 5 cities of the plain. The nearest we can get today is thinking that they're somewhere around the shores of the Dead Sea, say in modern-day Jordan. But even that is a best guess.
According to the book of Genesis, the story took place in the time of Abraham, centuries before Moses made his getaway from Egypt. Abraham was apparently the patriarch of a tribe of nomads who avoided the towns and cities, which may be why we know so little about them.
City dwellers were usually the people who wrote the history. Nomads usually are archaeologically invisible. What we have in the Old Testament, in the writings of these very literate tribal people who eventually became city dwellers themselves, is we have the nomads side of the story.
The Bible tells us that Abraham's tribesmen were constantly fighting with each other over pasture land. To settle the dispute, Abraham and his nephew Lot agreed to part ways, and Lot settled on the plain near the city of Sodom. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot moved his tent as far as Sodom. So Sodom was already an established city when Lot moved there. And if it was a typical Bronze Age settlement, about 1,000 people lived inside its walls. No one had ever found any evidence that such a city ever existed, but then again, no one had ever really looked. Until an archaeologist named William Albright made a trip to the Dead Sea in 1924.
Well, some of the people with him were certainly looking for Sodom and Gomorrah, generally the cities of the plains. So they came down there following the biblical text, and they circled around the southeast end shore of the Dead Sea. And just at the end of their survey down here, they came across the site of Babadrah.
Babadrah was a Bronze Age site, but there was no evidence it was a town. It seemed to be a cemetery, and Albright didn't have the resources to excavate it. So nearly 50 years passed before anyone went back to the site and began to dig. Archaeologist Paul Lapp led that 1967 excavation, and Thomas Schaub was one of the people doing the digging. He's been back to the site many times since, uncovering over the years a cemetery that was vast, even by Bronze Age standards.
This is the largest burial house that we've excavated at Babadrah. It is some 15 meters long and 7 meters across. We found hundreds and hundreds of pots here and skeletons and bones. We found a burial with gold jewelry. We excavated over 700 pieces of pottery that were funerary gifts here, including many small perfume juglets and many other objects, including cloth, and one unusual, the remnants of wooden poles that were used as a pallet to bring in the bodies to the burial house.
It was an exciting discovery, a graveyard that had been in use for about 1,000 years, around the time of Abraham and the destruction of Sodom. But there was nothing to link the cemetery to Sodom, except this. In about 2350 BC, the burials stopped. Suddenly. And no one knew why.
There are any number of reasons why a site might not be reoccupied. Some we can put our finger on, some we can't. Perhaps the water supply dried up. Perhaps the environment changed. Perhaps the climate changed. Perhaps the people were annihilated and completely killed.
Over the next few seasons, the archaeologists expanded their search, looking for signs of a lost city. And it wasn't long before they found something. Traces of human habitation on a hillside overlooking the cemetery. Stones and more stones. Pottery shards and dirt. Lots of dirt. That's what the archaeologists at Babadrah were up against in their search for the biblical Sodom.
There is a fascination with what has once been lost and yet now is found. This is what drives some archaeologists, and to a larger extent the general public, this idea that something could have been built and then completely lost, and yet is there under the earth waiting to be found.
To moviegoers raised on the exploits of Indiana Jones, this kind of archaeology probably lacks a certain amount of glamour.
Indiana Jones is back.
You'll notice that there's not a lot of digging in the Hollywood version of how an archaeologist/adventurer goes about finding things.
Trust me. Raiders of the Lost Ark.
But Indiana Jones wasn't the first person to stumble upon a lost city, conveniently hidden out in the open. That distinction might belong to a Swiss explorer named Burckhardt, who walked down a long, narrow canyon a few hundred years ago and caught a glimpse of something astonishing: the mother of all lost cities, Petra.
Petra itself is built by the Nabateans, much, much later than Sodom and Gomorrah, and it flourishes essentially during the Roman period, and then is lost. It's lost to history, lost to archaeology, and is not discovered until 100 or 200 years ago, like the 18th century. It is suddenly rediscovered. Of course, the locals always knew it was there.
A poet described Petra as a rose-red city half as old as time. Today, it's Jordan's most popular tourist site.
Here's this wonderful city that's carved into cliffs, actually carved into the very stone. And that stone changes color as the sun goes up and down.
Built into the cliffs with steep drops into narrow gorges all around, Petra is a feast for the eyes and the romantic in all of us. But Petra is the archaeological exception. It was found in mint condition above the ground and built on a colossal scale. Unfortunately for archaeologists working in the real world, lost cities are usually buried in the ground somewhere. And that's where Tom Schaub and his team found traces of a Bronze Age wall. It was on a hill overlooking the cemetery at Babadra, and it was the first sign that they might have come across a town of some kind. And the inescapable question was, had they found either Sodom or Gomorrah? The archaeologists began to dig, and gradually the outlines of a settlement emerged.
You see the face of the western wall of the site. That's the foundation of the wall, and you had a mud brick superstructure above that, which the wall was much taller than that, as far as we can tell, with the mud brick that collapsed.
One discovery led to another.
This is a good view of the one wall of the sanctuary and the other wall with the entranceway.
It wasn't quite the same as coming across a ready-made lost city, but the hard work began to pay off.
Right here is a open plaza area, and very likely the place where most of the town business was carried on inside of the gates.
As the data trickled in, archaeologists realized they had come across something unique. The foundations of a town from the time of Abraham, or even earlier, just where the Bible suggests Sodom was located. And like the cemetery, the town had been deserted, suddenly, at about the same time. But what exactly had been going on behind those mud brick walls? Was it the usual monotony of Bronze Age life? Or was it something else? Something sinful and corrupt? Had the ancient residents of Babadra engaged in depraved behavior that simply had to be punished? In short, were Babadra and Sodom one and the same? Not surprisingly, opinions differ.
Work done in the 1960s and 70s and subsequent years have revealed several sites from the time of Abraham, the early Bronze Age, the largest of them being Babadra. It would seem that that should be identified as the site of Sodom.
The sites of Babadra and the other sites on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea are fabulous sites, but they're sites mostly of the third millennium, gradually abandoned around 2000 BCE. And I think we would all agree that the population of these sites was Canaanite.
And to the writers of the Bible, Canaanite wasn't a term of endearment. Abraham's tribe of nomads likely saw the city-dwelling Canaanites as corrupt and promiscuous, the perfect example of the bad things that can happen when you stop living in a tent. That fits nicely with Sodom's reputation, a place with walls, rooms, secrets. And Lot, one of their own, had evidently forsaken his tent and moved into town. Had he been corrupted too?
We have an account of Abraham living near Hebron, down in the southern part of Canaan, and angels coming to visit him with the message that they were going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah.
Abraham asked God to spare the town if some of its citizens were shown to be good men. The question was, how many good men were needed to avoid God's wrath?
Abraham knew his nephew Lot was living there with his family, and so Abraham begins this dialogue for 30 righteous people. Will you still destroy the city?
God says, well, find me 20 righteous men in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. Just find me 20. And Abraham says, well, how about 10? It's interesting that you have in the Bible, you have a God who can bargain, whose mind can be changed by a good dealer like Abraham.
To count up the good men of Sodom, God sent 2 angels to visit the town. The angels walked through the city and prepared to spend the night on the streets. But when they came to Lot's house, Sodom's only good man took them in. That evening they shared a meal with Lot, his wife, and their 2 teenage daughters. But Lot's hospitality wasn't shared by the rest of the Sodomites, who had something very different in mind for the angels. They wanted Lot to hand them over, apparently so the townspeople could use them for sex. But Lot refused. Sort of.
Lot, at some point, he's trying to bargain with the townspeople. What if I give you my 2 daughters instead of these angels? And the townspeople, no, I want the angels. And that really becomes, in that cautionary tale, the final straw for God. And it's like, okay, Lot, you and your family, get out of town. This place is toast.
The debate about whether the Bible is an accurate historical record has been going on for centuries, and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is no exception.
Yeah, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah happened, sure. How we know it? We heard it from our forefathers.
We need to remember that the biblical stories about the Israelites were probably not written down before the 8th or 7th century, centuries after the period in question.
I think the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of the plain, these multiple destructions of cities, might be a telescoping of several cities that were destroyed at around the same time.
There's no question that the destruction of a city is a memorable event, something that would have been passed down from generation to generation. And throughout history, cities have been destroyed for one reason or another. though their names live on. Troy and Carthage were demolished in a war. So were Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The wrath of nature buried Pompeii under 20 feet of hot ash when Vesuvius erupted. San Francisco was leveled by an earthquake. Hurricane Katrina battered and then submerged New Orleans. The insurance companies call them acts of God, and people living in the Bronze Age probably wouldn't have argued with that assessment.
When you read the Bible, you see their observations of a natural phenomenon as this mysticism, as this fantastic power of God.
Natural disasters have always destroyed cities. We're seeing that very well in today's world, whether it's a tsunami or it's an earthquake or it's an overflowing river and a torrent of mud. Yes, natural disasters destroy cities. And of course that could have crept into the biblical narrative.
But of all the different kinds of natural disasters, one seems especially suited to have caused the destruction at Sodom and Gomorrah. When you think about a rain of fire, it's easy to imagine a volcano.
Over and over again, we see the power of volcanoes being associated with the power of God. Sodom and Gomorrah is a perfect example of volcanic eruption in the Bible.
Many of the phenomena associated with volcanic eruptions seem to appear in the biblical account.
We have the earth shaking, we have the same, the pillars of fire, ash falling, stones falling, pyroclastic flows, consuming bodies, and of course, sinners being punished by God for their sins.
Unfortunately, there isn't much evidence for erupting volcanoes near the Dead Sea in biblical times. But there's plenty of proof that another kind of geological upheaval was wreaking havoc in the area back then. A force that may account for the famous destruction of another city, not too far from the Dead Sea. The city was Jericho. According to the Bible, an Israelite leader named Joshua conquered Jericho after its walls somehow, mysteriously, crumbled. And if you're looking for a natural explanation, you don't have to look very far. Because Jericho, it turns out, was built on an earthquake fault line.
There are actually quite a number of faults on either side of Jericho. And virtually every century, you had one or two earthquakes, in some centuries even as many as 6.
But it's an exceedingly unhealthy place to build a city, or a little bit like San Francisco.
If there's a Guinness Book of Records for cities, Jericho probably deserves the first entry.
Jericho is the oldest known continuously inhabited city in the world. It's been inhabited for 10,000 years. It's still inhabited.
Now the sprawling mound where all of Jericho's previous incarnations are buried lies under a cable car ride, a prime attraction for tourists visiting the Holy Land.
It's, going to be ruin upon ruin, inexplicable ruin upon top of another inexplicable ruin for the population living there. So of course you're going to get stories growing up as to why that wall has tumbled down, why that wall has fallen.
Hidden within the mound are the ruins of City 4, which may date from Joshua's time, give or take an important few hundred years. And many of the walls show signs of having been struck by an earthquake, which may or may not square with the biblical account of how the city fell. The Bible story begins with Joshua's army gathered on the far side of the Jordan River, another group of herdsmen mistrustful of city dwellers.
Here is Joshua on the east side with his nomadic tribes, and he is waiting for a way in which he could bring his animals across the Jordan River. And this is not that easy. Well, lo and behold, suddenly there's an earthquake.
What happens next is eerily reminiscent of the story of Moses' escape from Egypt. An inexplicable parting of the waters that allows Joshua and his army to cross on a dry riverbed. But this miracle may have a natural explanation.
In the region called Damia, when we get these earthquakes, we get huge avalanches that flow across and actually block the flow of the river for a day or two. Downstream, the river actually runs dry. In fact, Damia, that province, is the province after which we derive the word Dan.
Did a military opportunity simply present itself to Joshua and his men? It's possible. Because the Bible places the attack just after the spring harvest, which is exactly the wrong time for anyone planning a siege.
If you're going to attack a city, you want to surround it and starve the people off. You don't attack a city when the crops have just been harvested and the city is full of food and there's no crops in the field for you to harvest for your army.
What happens to Jericho next sounds like a miracle.
We read in Joshua chapter 6 that the Israelites walked around the city for 6 days, and on the seventh day blew the trumpets. The people shouted, and the Bible says the walls fell down, and the Israelites stormed the city.
Even the sound of trumpets can be explained.
An earthquake almost always, just before it hits, is characterized by a roar. Very many people describe it from small earthquakes, for instance, like a fireplace roaring. Others say, no, it was more like a jet plane that came by, or thunder that is heard in the distance.
So Jericho was leveled, and the Bible says that one of the walls fell down flat, so the invaders could go up into the city. That description may square with some of the archaeological finds, like the collapsed city walls at the base of the tell.
These were very large, thick, mud brick walls, but one of the walls actually did, at the time of the destruction of Jericho's city, fall outward. And this is exactly what we see archaeologically. It formed a natural ramp up into the city where people could have walked up a rather smooth incline right into the city with almost no resistance.
The Bible tells us the Israelites sacked and burned the city, but it wasn't looted. That seems to fit with the discovery of wheat and barley buried in City 4's ashes.
Jars full of grain, not half full or quarter full, full of grain. Clearly, the harvest had just been taken in agreement with the Bible. Well, why was it left there at Jericho to be burned in the fire?
Again, the Bible offers an explanation.
The grain was not to be taken by the people seizing the city, that it was to be left there or burned or sacrificed to God by burning, but it was not to be taken.
Most archaeologists agree that Jericho was destroyed at least once in biblical times, but the dates don't seem to correspond with Joshua's conquest.
Now there is a big destruction, a violent destruction by fire of the city of Jericho, which most archaeologists would date between around 1500 and 1475, and they would attribute it to the Egyptians.
If we're trying to put Jericho into the context of the biblical story, and we're looking for Jericho that was built in about 1,200 years BC, plus minus, it didn't have walls, so they didn't come tumbling down, whether it was a trumpet being blown at them or something else, or an earthquake. There weren't walls.
Here is the real problem. In the 13th century BC, when a Jericho might have been there to have been destroyed by a Joshua, there is nothing. The mound is abandoned. I always say to believers, if they need something like a miracle, Joshua destroyed a city that wasn't even there. A stupendous miracle.
Whether or not Jericho was destroyed like the Bible says it was, there's no doubt the city was repeatedly shaken by earthquakes. And the same seismic fault line that runs under Jericho also continues to the south, where it would have passed beneath Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the plain. "5,000 years ago, humans had no rational way to explain the sometimes violent forces that swept over their world. Storms and tornadoes, floods and earthquakes seemed to happen for no apparent reason. In the biblical lands, the earth underfoot constantly shifted, sometimes transforming the landscape almost overnight.
The entire course of a river could change dramatically, and you would end up having to rebuild your roads and your homes in the lifetime of an ordinary house cat. There was no common sense to the way things operated in their universe, a very, very chaotic universe.
One example of that chaos can be found in the remains of an ancient city called Mashkan Shapir, located in present-day Iraq. Some historians have even speculated that what happened to Mashkan Shapir inspired the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's not hard to see why.
Something unusual happened in Mashkan Shapir. Something so unusual that the city was never rebuilt, inhabited again.
Like Sodom and Gomorrah, Mashkan Shapir seems to have ended its life in a rain of fire.
Mashkan Shapir was a city that was built mostly out of mud brick, which really is not very flammable. And yet we find a tremendous conflagration that consumed at least 1/3 of the city, burned animals to the bone.
Today, we know something about Mashkan Shapir that the ancients couldn't have known, and it may explain what happened.
Mashkan Shapir, like almost any other city built in the Tigris-Euphrates region 4,000 years ago, was over pools of natural gas and oil. And it's the natural gas that's a problem. If you get the right kind of earthquake, it's going to expand and it's going to come jetting out of the ground just like a volcanic eruption. Just like literally a gusher of natural gas.
It's a lethal combination of gas followed by oil under pressure. All it needs is a spark from a cooking hut.
The effect will be like a giant fuel air bomb detonating over and around and in the city. And we know from just looking at the Kuwait fires how frightening that can be. I mean, the smoke is black. It blots out the sun. It blots out the stars. It's raining soot everywhere. You just see these huge, bright flames shooting into the sky, out of the ground, in the middle of the city. A tremendous waterfall of fire lighting up the night.
A city destroyed by something no one could explain, except with words like fire and brimstone. And the question is, could something similar have happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? It's certainly possible. Not only does the area around the Dead Sea have oil and gas deposits deep underground, but tar and sulfur also exist closer to the surface. And sulfur was what the ancients called brimstone. Oil, gas, tar, sulfur, in an area prone to earthquakes. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah, or Babadra, might have been sitting on a time bomb. And if what happened to Mashkan Shapir happened here, it probably started with a tremor.
Well, the first thing usually is a movement which is more sort of up and down, and then everything starts swaying. And it can sway for a minute, maybe sometimes with very heavy earthquakes as much as 1.5 minutes or so on. For most people involved in it, it feels like an eternity, obviously.
The earthquake opens up pockets of natural gas, while tar and sulfur deposits bubble to the surface.
If the people at that time were preparing food or anything like that, you only need one fireplace and there's gas coming across it, and you would have very significant effects.
In fact, what you'd have is a spectacular Bronze Age disaster. When the gas ignites, oil, tar, and sulfur deposits are set ablaze. Fire cascades over the town. Anyone in the area would have been incinerated. And anyone at a safe distance would have witnessed something astonishing. Someone like Lot and his family. According to the Bible, they were headed toward the city of Zoar when the hail of fire and brimstone took place. The angels had warned them not to look back at Sodom as they fled. But Lot's wife ignored the warning. She turned, and whatever she saw transfixed her to the spot, transforming her, in the Bible's memorable phrase, into a pillar of salt. But at Babadra, proposed by some as the site of Sodom, there's little evidence of such a dramatic destruction by fire. Instead, the town seems to have fallen victim to an invading army that tried to enter through the western gate.
Right in the center of the gateway, we found a blocking wall where they had used everything but the kitchen sink to throw in there, which was our first clue that the end of the site may have been associated with some sort of military encounter, because they were blocking the entrance to the city.
To get through the massive wood gate, the invaders built a roaring hot fire next to it.
What we find from the superstructure of the wall, the collapse of the mud brick, which was vitrified, almost reddish, showing the flame that was up against the town wall on the outside as they attacked. It doesn't indicate that they actually entered into the city, but it's certainly that there was some sort of an attack on the city.
There's no way to know when the attack happened or what became of the people who lived here. All we know is that by about 2350 BC, no one was living in the town or using the cemetery. Like Lot and his two daughters, any survivors from Babadra were now on their own. In the Bible, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah doesn't have a happy ending, even for Lot and his family, who managed to escape. We're told that Lot came to the city of Zoar following the destruction, but was afraid to live there. So Lot and his two daughters took refuge in a cave. Cut off from other men, and perhaps still under the corrupting influence of the city, Lot's daughters decided to seduce their father. They plied Lot with wine and then had sex with him. Both girls became pregnant, and the sons they bore went on to father 2 more tribes of Canaanites, who the Israelites later conquered. The Bible locates Zur near the modern city of Safi, about 30 miles south of Babadra. And that's where Greek archaeologists discovered something in 1989 that had been lost for 1,000 years. A Byzantine monastery built in front of a cave, dedicated to Saint Lot.
They thought that this particular cave where they built their church was the cave where Lot and his daughters lived. Well, there's no way to prove that for certain, but it is interesting that inside the cave they did find evidence for occupation back in that time period.
That time period would have put the occupation of Lot's cave in the early Bronze Age, contemporary with Babadra. And it was just south of Babadra that Tom Schaub and his partner practically stumbled on a second lost city. It started when they noticed an odd rock formation on top of a hill. It turned out to be a town wall.
This is the same wall that Walter Rast and I spied from the road as we drove up during our 1973 survey. And we almost ran up the steep hills of Numera, came along and walked along the southern wall line, began to see possible wall lines of structures within the town site.
An examination of pottery shards convinced them they'd found another early Bronze Age town, just a few miles from Babadra. They called the new site Numera. Like Babadra, it was walled, but it was much smaller, home to a few hundred people at most.
We began to realize that this site was contemporary with Babadra, and eventually during our excavations we began to realize it was almost like a sister city.
I think it was a fairly prosperous town, but a kind of a suburb of the larger city to the north, Babadra.
But unlike Babadra, Numera had been abandoned not too long after it was built.
Numera was occupied for a relatively brief period, perhaps no more than a century, and fortunately for archaeologists, never settled again, so nobody actually lived on top of it, dug into the remains, reused the stones.
2 settlements, one large, one small, a few hours' walk from each other. Was it possible they'd found Sodom's sister city of Gomorrah?
If Abraham goes way back in early history, the only sites from that period down to the Iron Age that are walled towns, that are sizable, are these 2 sites of Babadra and Numera. So they have become, in the minds of many, prime candidates for the ancient traditions of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Like Babadra, Numera showed signs that its inhabitants had fled and never returned, but not because of a war.
There's no signs of breaching of walls that would have occurred by warfare. There are no remains of weapons. There are no dead soldiers, as you find, for example, at a number of sites where there have been battles.
What they did find was the skeletons of 2 men, crushed to death.
Well, this is the tower. It's in front of that tower, of course, that we found the most striking evidence of the last days of the town, because there were 2 skeletons underneath the collapse of the tower.
And these were the skeletons of adult males who had obviously died suddenly. This wasn't a burial, this wasn't a tomb. These were people who died in an open public area. And we think that they had died because the tower, where they were either squatting or perhaps they'd been left behind as guards when everybody else left the city, simply collapsed on top of them.
The suspected culprit? Another earthquake.
My hypothesis is that the inhabitants perhaps experienced a preliminary tremor and left the city for the open country because they knew they'd be safer there. And a few stayed behind, maybe as guards, and they were the ones who died in the city.
The ruins of Numira also revealed something else, something with a biblical echo. Unlike her sister city, Numira had been consumed by fire.
Everything that we've excavated has indicated a very heavy destruction level. We find up to 30 to 40 centimeters of ashy debris, including the remains of charred wooden beams and of the occupational debris. So whatever happened here, and it's pretty widespread over the site, there was a major fire that took place.
There was a thick layer of ashes below the topsoil all over the site. Thatch roofs and that sort of stuff. Wooden roof beams would have burned very quickly.
If the fire had been accompanied by exploding gas, tar, and sulfur deposits, the results would have been unforgettable.
It doesn't take much to imagine that if you had a conflagration, the effects of bitumen and asphalt in that would be spectacular. And again, enough, I think, to earn these cities an enduring place in folk memory for their destruction.
Afterwards, the skeletons of both towns would have sat bleaching in the sun, while 1,000 years of travelers passed them by and heard stories about how they died.
So you're talking about people handing down by word of mouth a story about the destruction of these two cities for more than 1,000 years. And who knows what got changed in the telling.
You might also have in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities that were destroyed in either this one great disaster or in several disasters over time that are telescoped, again, possibly the nomad side of the story.
You're picking up different strands from different periods of history, blending them together, creating a coherent narrative about an event which actually didn't happen.
There's no doubt that something happened out here a little over 4,000 years ago. But what it was, invasion, earthquake, fire, or some combination of all three, we'll probably never know. But here's something to consider. The biblical name Sodom was derived from the Hebrew word Sodom, which means burnt. Gomorrah is derived from the Hebrew word Amorah, which means buried or submerged. And you could hardly find better words to describe Numira and Babadra in the centuries that followed their destruction. So maybe the Bible was onto something after all.
I think it's very important not to make the writers and the editors of the Hebrew Bible look like charlatans or fools. They were telling the truth as they understood it.
And the truth as they understood it involves sex and destruction, sin and the wrath of God. Connect the dots, apply a moral, and you have a story that will live for 1,000 years, or even more.